There's a third thing that's very important, and that's the dating tests that have been performed. Needless to say, when you have an artifact like this, you absolutely want the dating evidence to be, completely solid. Well, in 1988, a carbon dating was done that basically dated the shroud to about 700 years ago, between 1250 to 1350 AD. Well, that would put it way out of the range of the first century. So a lot of people thought, well, gee, this is automatically debunked, and everybody was just, let's call it a day. It was debunked. But then in 1998, they took this the piece of the shroud that was removed from the cloth for the sample, right? They took it from a very controversial site, right in a corner that was burned during the fire of Chambéry in the 1500s. And when it was burned, basically the sisters in 1500 took cotton fibers and interwove it in a process called invisible mending, and wove it into the shroud to patch up the holes from the fire. Now, that automatically means that there's going to be variability and heterogeneity in any kind of carbon sample. So anyway, Dr. Ray Rogers, a very prestigious thermochemist here at Los Alamos Labs, he's now deceased, but at the time, in 1998, 10 years after the 1988 carbon dating, he said, this sample can't possibly be right.
So they carbon dated the sample that had been kind of manipulated by these nuns after the fire.
That's sample
where they got the sample.
took.
Okay.
And then he verified it. So Rogers said, I'm getting some sticky tapes from that exact area from the 1978 Stirrup investigation. I'm taking some sticky tapes from those areas, and I'm going to do chemical pyrolysis. I'm going to do mass spectrometry. I'm going to do a bunch of other what we call thermochemical tests. Then he comes out in 1998 in the Analecta Thermochimica, which is a very prestigious thermochemical journal, which he was the editor of. By the way, for many years he had been the editor of. He puts it in there, and he basically says, look, he says, there's no way in which the sample that was taken could have come from the original shroud. I mean, how can you have cotton fibers? And the shroud's made of linen. There's no relation chemically to cotton. And cotton fibers, no less, that are dyed with a gum dye mordant that was only available in the Middle Ages in the 12th century or later. So how are you going to explain that?
Why did they do that, Father Spitzer? Why did they take a little piece off the edge as the sample? Is that because to protect the integrity of the larger
that
linen piece?
That ostensibly was the reason, but maybe there are other reasons. And I don't want to say there were people trying to do discrediting actions, but I'll just simply say, man, it's hard for me to believe that was an unbiased sample, because the protocols originally called for in 1978 required that a sample be taken from 7 spots. To take it from only one very controversial spot that was burned and remended, and then split that sample into 3 parts and give it to 3 labs, it's very, very, very suspicious. I must tell you this. And so I'm just not going to say they were there. I'll go with your ostensible, they wanted to take it from someplace that would not.
So when the new guy is doing the new tests that are the best-in-class tests for carbon dating, are they doing carbon dating now on the whole?
No, they're not going to do it, and I'm going to give you the reason for that in just 1 minute. But there were 4 other tests that immediately showed that the carbon tests were wrong. And I'll tell you why in just a moment, that you can't use carbon dating in the future, because essentially the particle radiation hypothesis shows that what happens is if you've got a neutron flux, and I haven't explained any of this yet, but when you have a neutron flux, what winds up happening is the neutrons will irradiate what's called the N14. N14 is an ingredient in cellulose, which is an ingredient in linen. And so you get an irradiated N14, it turns into C14. Well, C14 is precisely the kind of carbon that's measured in a C14 dating test. So when Dr. Arthur Lind in this country discovered this, he said, look, you cannot use a carbon dating. There's, if there really was a neutron flux, which produced this thing, a flow of neutrons that left the body, and I'll explain in a moment, then there's just no way you could be testing for C14 because there's too much N14 in the linen that could get, turned into C14. But 4 other tests were developed in the meantime. The first was a Fourier-transformed infrared spectroscopy. The second one was a Raman laser spectroscopy. And the next one was a mechanical compressibility and tension test. Now, these were done by Giulio Fanti and his team at the Italian National Labs, and very reputable, good people. They basically showed conclusively that the cloth, on the basis of these 3 tests, which are really not affected by a fire like a Chambéry or getting burned and having heterogeneous material, and so it's not affected by carbon. So they put these 3 tests together and came up with an age of 90 AD, plus or minus 200 years, with a 95% confidence level.
Wow.
Then came Dr. Liberato Di Caro and his huge team, again, another team at Italian National Labs, and they put together a new kind of testing, very accurate, refined testing, peer-reviewed over 3 years, called wide-angle X-ray scattering test. Now, after the peer review testing and the acceptance of the test as valid, then they took a sample from the Shroud and dated the Shroud to between 54 AD to 75 AD. So like mid-1st century. Hello, within spitting distance of Jesus, with a very small error, margin of error, and a very high, again, 95% level confidence level.